Gente, muito bom. Boa tarde, bem-vindos. Eu vou falar rapidamente em português, mas eu gostaria de agradecer novamente ao Brendan e ao nosso parceiro Eduardo Wolf, de sempre. Eduardo coordenou o grupo aqui no Labô, Eduardo, enfim, nosso brother, mais do que isso, hoje professor da UNB. Quem sabe volta, né, Edu? Assim, estou jogando no ar essa informação. E eu agradeço todo mundo que está aqui, muito obrigada. É um momento muito importante da gente discutir After the Pogrom, one of the most important books and one of the best books that I have read so far about everything that has been happening. And I forgot that I was speaking in Portuguese, and then I turned into English out of a
Okay.
sudden. And then, okay.
Word.
Uh, Okay, so Eduardo is going to conduct this talk with Brendan. And then, if you have questions and if you don't know how to write them in English, quem não sabe escrever as perguntas e quiser fazer, I can translate. Eu posso traduzir para vocês. Tudo bem? Thank you
All right.
so much, Brendan. Edu, please.
So, Brendan, let me just start by thanking you for having accepted this invitation and saying that it is actually a great pleasure because back in 2018, I was involved in inviting you to Porto Alegre in Brazil, to the Freedom Forum and the Atlantis, and we had a tremendous discussion there. And I had the pleasure also to publish you. I believe it was your first piece in Portuguese in O Estado de São Paulo. I will share with people later on. It was May 2018. And the piece was, Why Do You Hate Israel So Much? It was a piece you wrote for the Spike, obviously, and people know you from Spike magazine and also from the Spectator and now your books and the podcast, the Brendan O Neill show. And it's really a great pleasure to have you here. Although I would much prefer to have a different kind of conversation and not this one. And why is that? It's because your book, After the Pogrom, 7 October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization, it's the book I would rather not to have read. I would rather not to have to deal with this stuff. But we have to do it. And you're doing it in the most amazing way. So let me start this conversation, and I want it to be really non-academic and really, just to engage with you and to people who are watching us right now. Quoting your first essay in this book, you write the following. There were two eruptions of barbarism in October 2023. The first was Hamas pogrom of 7 October, in which more than 1,000 people were slaughtered and many others maimed, raped, and kidnapped. The second was the sympathy for the pogrom across much of the Western world. Now, let me ask you this. More than 400 days after the 7th October, the Amsterdam pogrom happened. Mm-hmm. So how is it that the second form of barbarism that you described is still going on, strong and steady? How do you think this is possible?
Well, thank you, Eduardo, for that question and for your introduction. I have very fond memories of our meeting in 2018 in Brazil and again in London a couple of years later. So it's great to see you again, and it's great to be here talking to all of you this evening. I think, I guess the main point of my book is not to look at what happened on 7th of October and not really to look at the Middle East itself, the dynamics of the Middle East or the future of Israel or the future of the Palestinian territories. It really is just an attempt to analyze what happened in the West, to look at the impact that 7th of October had in the West. And the point I make in the book is that what 7th of October did, it really drew to the surface of our societies all the various anti-civilizational trends, all the various bigotries, all the various crises, the moral crises that we've been aware of for some time. They really did come to the surface. They really did explode into public view. And, I knew the response to 7th of October was going to be bad. I said it on the day that the pogrom happened. I wrote a piece for Spike on 7th of October 2023, in which I said the response is going to be bad. There will be people in the West who will make excuses for this. There will be people who will call it an act of resistance. So I knew that was going to happen, but it was so much worse than I expected. It was so much worse. There were events that I almost couldn't believe. So one example is that in London on the 9th of October, this was 36 hours after the pogrom, there was a celebration outside the Israeli embassy in London. People were dancing, they were playing pop music, they were setting off fireworks, they were singing songs. This was a pro-pogrom celebration on the streets of London in 2023. And I make the point in my book that it would be as bad as if people had poured into the streets of London to celebrate Kristallnacht. And so my book is an attempt to remind people about all of these things that happened and try and make sense of them within a framework of a crisis of civilization, because I think that's what we're currently living through.
Now, that's what I want to press you on, because one of the major things during this last year was how young people reacted to this in the West, right? They were watching, and they had the videos, they had the GoPros videos from Hamas, they had footage, they had anything they could ask for. Their fellow youngsters back in Israel being murdered, being slaughtered, and they were cheering for the murderers. And you quote a strong and very astonishing percentage of young people in America and also in the UK, around 50%, are okay with Hamas. They are okay with the disappearance of Israel. They want to give in. And now you mentioned in your first answer, and it's all across your book, the idea that this is not just one point. This is not just one thing happening right now. This is a major trend. One of the trends in which you quote, I believe it's in the 6th or 7th essay, you trace it back to an essay back in the 1990s in the Socialist Worker Review magazine, in which there was this sort of entanglement between Islamism and the left. How do you explain this in terms of how the youth now see Islamists, anti-gay people, anti-women, anti-human rights people as being on the side of the left and being on the side of the youth and the revolution or whatever? How is this trend operating right now?
It's really crazy, as you've just outlined it there. It is quite shocking. And in Europe, it's referred to as the Islamo-left. This is a term that comes from France originally, but it's now used across Europe. We call it the Islamo-left, which is a left that has essentially thrown its lot in with radical Islamists, or it feels sympathy for radical Islamists, and it makes excuses for them. And the pamphlet you refer to was published in 1994. It was called The Prophet and the Proletariat. So that really sums up what it was about. And it was really an analysis of when it might be appropriate for the left to make alliances with Islamists. And the thing about this pamphlet that is very interesting is that it's quite cautious. It says, look, we have to recognize that these are fascistic movements. They're misogynistic, they're homophobic, they're anti-Semitic, of course. So we have to be careful. But then it says they're also anti-imperialist, so there might be opportunities for alliances. Now, I think the whole pamphlet was completely insane. You can't make alliances with anti-Semites and misogynists and mass murderers. That is a really stupid thing to do. But at least the pamphlet had a note of caution. It told people to be wary. It said, look, let's make alliances, but let's keep them at arm's length. What's happened since then is that now the left is in bed with radical Islamists. We see people marching on our streets chanting, "We are all Hezbollah now." We see young people waving Hamas flags or wearing Hamas-style bandanas. We see people holding up banners, as they did in New York City, saying, long live 7th of October. So that's not long live Palestine. That's long live 7th of October, the day of the pogrom itself. So they are now fully on board with radical Islamists. And I think it's a suicidal alliance. And I make the point in my book that if you look at a group like Queers for Palestine, for example, if they ever went to Gaza, they would be killed very, very quickly. This is a suicidal movement that is cozying up to a movement that would kill them, that would imprison them, that would certainly torture them and repress them. And I think what draws this unlikely alliance together is really a rejection of modernity, a rejection of enlightenment. Because what the modern left and radical Islamists share in common is an almost violent contempt for modern society. So the left over time, and we see this in the academy, we see it on the streets, we see it in left-wing thought and even in the commentariat, they've increasingly turned against the virtues of modernity. They are now anti-industrial, they are anti-modern. They think the modern world is a pox on the planet and there are too many people and the Enlightenment was a mistake. And if only we could turn the clock back to a more innocent time. That is really at the forefront of left-wing thinking these days. And Islamists, of course, are obviously anti-modernity. They want to go back to the caliphate. They want to reconquer Andalusia. They want to go back to the old system of a very regressive, almost medieval form of social organization. So I think they're drawn together through their shared contempt for enlightened life. And that's one of the reasons it's important to challenge them, because as we've seen over the past year, the chief victims of this turn against enlightenment are primarily Jewish people, but also women, gay people, trade unionists, the left. These are the people who bear the brunt of the radical hatred for modern society that comes from both Islamists and the left. So the left has abandoned all of its old values and sided with radical Islamists. And that's one thing that's become incredibly clear since 7th of October.
Now, this is a very huge topic, of course, because, we could discuss what happened to the left during the last 4 decades, at least 3 or 4 decades, at least since the fall of the Berlin Wall and all that. But in one way, it's really connected to what we are watching and what we are living in right now, because in a sense, the same kinds of shifts that happened, let's say, in terms of the political alignment in the US elections, in which we watched a new social pact with, regular working class people and a multiracial coalition voting to what would be described as the right wing, or even by some standards, extreme right. People on the left called Donald Trump extreme right, etc., the right, the far right, etc. So we have this same sort of realignment with the left in terms of who are they fighting for, what are they fighting for, and who are they fellow travelers. Now, one way to describe this would be to say that there's the fall of the Berlin Wall and there's the collapse of the Soviet Union. But another way is to describe a different sort of theory and a different sort of academic milieu, which is decolonization and post-colonial studies, etc., etc. You touch on both these issues in some of the essays in your book, and I would like to explore this with you. Would you wade more into the, what is the replacement for our struggle and our fight after the collapse of the Soviet Union, or more to the academic side? Which plays the biggest role in this realignment with the left?
That's a really good question. I think the easy answer, of course, is that there's interplay between those two things and they are interconnected. The way I see, if you look at America, for example, you look at the multiracial working class alliance that has just put Trump into power, to the shock of the left and to the shock of polite society in Europe. They can't believe what's happened because they're so aloof and they're so cut off. They don't know what's happening in society. I think, working class Americans, and I spoke to many of them when I was in the US a couple of weeks ago, they feel very strongly that they are under both economic attack and cultural attack. So they will say all the time that we don't have enough money. Our jobs are being outsourced to foreign countries. We're not being paid in the way that we should be paid. Inflation is soaring. Prices are too high. The Democrats aren't doing anything about it. So we're going to look to Trump to see if he'll do something about it. So they're worried about the economic attack on their way of life, but they're also equally worried, if not more worried, by the cultural attack, which is this very elitist coastal view of redneck America and working class America as ignorant and backward and not up to date with woke language, and they don't wear the right pronoun badges, and they don't use the right language about race and gender and so on. So they're also looked upon as backward in that way as well. So they feel very strongly that there's a two-pronged attack on their way of life. There's an attack on their bank balances, and there's an attack on their community life, their family life, their beliefs. And I think you can see that in Europe as well. In Britain and across Europe, there is a real sense amongst working class communities that the elites, many of whom are left-wing elites, for want of a better word, just don't take them seriously as citizens and are demeaning them both economically and culturally. So I think that's something that's happening, and that's coming much more to the surface of society. I think the Democrats are going to have a very hard time recovering from this election because they're going to have a reckoning with themselves and ask themselves some serious questions. I don't think they'll come up with the right answers, by the way, but they're going to have to try. But in relation to how the left changed, I do think it's a post-Cold War situation. I think the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, was a real huge psychological and political blow to the left across the world. Some of the left was pro-Soviet Union, some of the left was anti-Soviet Union, but the disappearance of the Soviet Union nonetheless had a huge psychological blow on the left, because suddenly the one society they could point to as an alternative to capitalism no longer existed. So the rug was pulled out from under their feet and they were at a loss. And one of the points I make in my book is that they lost the Soviet Union. They became increasingly disappointed with their own working classes. So they went looking for new constituencies. And that's when they start to discover the politics of race and gender rather than the politics of class. That's when they start aligning with radical Islamists because they can no longer align with communist states. So they look for new alignments to make and new alliances to make, and they've chosen very bad ones. But I think, in relation to the academy and what's happening in the political world, I do think they are connected. And I do think something like decolonization, which is a very fashionable idea in Western universities, especially in Anglo-American society, this is where they want to rid the curriculum of a reliance on white authors and Western authors and Enlightenment thinkers and bring in other voices as well. That kind of decolonization instinct is all part and parcel of the turn against Western values themselves and against Western civilization itself. And so in Western society, that's very pronounced. And those decolonization trends have a huge impact, not only in universities, but in political thinking more broadly. So I think political developments in the post-Cold War era married together with this academic abandonment of enlightened thought, I think it's really an unholy marriage of those two things that has led us to this situation.
No, that's great. I'd like to unpack a little bit these two aspects of the same phenomenon, if you agree with me. The first question would be this. In a way, there's a sense of when you consider who is actually doing the left's work. I mean, you're not talking about trade unionists anymore. There was this guy, I believe he was the responsible for the Democratic Party in Philadelphia. And he was complaining. He was there for, I don't know, 45 years, 40 years, and he was not approached by Harry's team. He never spoke to her, and not at all. So that was quite a very interesting example of what they're doing with classical working class people that was in the party. They were in the party, but not anymore. So when you consider who are the major players now on the left, academics, and one category, I don't know if you created this, man, but if you did, Hassan, the activist class, this is the way you described it, at least two of the S's. I just adore the expression. So this activist class as opposed to the working class, right? So in a way, there's this existential aspect, there's this philosophical and existential aspect of, there's no Hitler here, there's no Mussolini here. The reality I'm facing is materially a very good one if I'm part of the activist class, but I have to face some existential threat. So, oh, now I have it. There's this, I have, I don't know, colonial past, some sort of grievance of the sort. So there's this way in which they there's the psychodrama in the way they are replacing former real enemies and real obstacles in terms of the improvement of the working class in the West for fantasies. They're more like Marvel villains than actual realities. Do you see this aspect also playing a role, this psychological aspect? Because it's really strong when I watch things from abroad. This is what strikes me the most, maybe.
Absolutely. I really strongly agree with that. And they magic up these villainous figures in order to give themselves a sense of purpose, in order to give their political lives some meaning. And I can't remember who referred to it, but it was Susan Sontag who said, we live in an era not of apocalypse now, but apocalypse from now on. And what she meant was that there is this constant search for the apocalypse. There's this constant search for the end times event, the existential threat against which the political class or the activist class might organize themselves and define themselves. So the obvious one is climate change. Now, I think climate change is real. I'm not a climate change denier, but I don't believe it's the end of the world. I don't believe, as someone like Greta Thunberg says, that billions of people will die. I think it's been reimagined as an apocalyptic moment in order to provide a sense of historic purpose to a political class that doesn't have historic purpose. So climate change is one example, but there are many others. And more recently, they've kind of forgotten about climate change to a certain extent, and they focus on other demonic figures. I mean, Trump is an obvious example. Trump is the new Hitler. He's Hitler 2.0. He is the man against which they must define themselves. It will be interesting to see if they do that as much this time as they did in 2016. I'm sure you will remember the meltdown when Trump was elected in 2016. It was absolutely deranged. I mean, there were mass protests in London. People were marching through the streets saying, Hitler not welcome, get this fascist out of Britain, because he was visiting Britain. They went mad. I'm not sure they will do it to the same extent this time, because I think what they've realized at some level is that this is not just a one-off 2016 blip. This is now a real movement. There is now a real dynamic within the American working class that sees Trump as preferable to the Democrats. So they might have had their wings clipped a little bit. They might be subdued in comparison to 2016 because they recognize it's a real thing now. But yeah, there's this constant search for the existential foe in order to give oneself a sense of mission. And, there is so much hypocrisy bound up in this. And you mentioned the Amsterdam pogrom earlier on, which I think is an incredibly important event. Not only the event itself, which was horrendous, but also, even more importantly, the response to it and the apologism for it that we've seen in intellectual circles in Europe. And just think about last week. Last week started with the activist class crying over the election of the fascist Donald Trump, which is how they see him. And it ended with them making excuses for fascist violence in Amsterdam. So these are people who cry virtuous tears over fake fascism and justify real fascism, or something that feels like real fascism, the beating and the humiliation and the persecution of Jewish people on the streets of Amsterdam. So there's so much hypocrisy bound up in this. And that's why I think what we're living through at the moment, and what we've been living through since 7th of October, is not only horrendous, but also quite usefully eye-opening. Obviously, I would prefer that this event had never taken place and that the horrors that sprung from it had never taken place. But it did. There's nothing we can do about it. And what it has done is shine a light on our own societies. And it has exposed all the cracks in our own societies. And that's why when we have this activist class crying over Trump and saying he's a new fascist, which they do for other European politicians too, but then they make excuses for Amsterdam, or then they make excuses for Hamas, or then they say, well, 7th of October was inevitable and it wasn't a pogrom, it was an act of resistance. That's the moment at which you can say, right, there you are, I've got you. You are making up the existence of fascism in America while denying the existence of fascism in Europe. You are chasing after the fascist bogeyman of Donald Trump while turning a blind eye to the fascist reality of Hamas. And it's moments like that where you can really tease out these conflicts and these intellectual tensions. And it's a really useful way to help other people see the argument. And I've had so many instances over the past year where I've been talking in public and people have come around to this kind of way of thinking where they start to recognize how horrific 7th of October was and how horrific the response in the West was. And it's good to be able to explain to people the nature of the crisis we're living through and what is a phony problem and what is a real problem.
Yeah, this is part of why I wanted to insist on this question, because and I think it will connect. It will be a very smooth connection with the academic branch of our discussion right now. Because when you see the way you present in the book how the 1930s metaphor and the Nazi and fascism metaphor played out during the last decade or so, right? So Brexit, Donald Trump in 2016, other events you could maybe think about, maybe some sort of stuff about the COVID, et cetera, et cetera. So people are always talking about the 1930s and the 1930s. So in one way, I think there's this psychological aspect that we were discussing right now. You know, my life is really, really good. It's really regular. It's really ordinary. There's nothing going wrong with me. So maybe there's a huge menace, and it's fascism, is the comeback of the 1930s. Okay, and this was brilliantly explained in your book, how when the actual thing appeared, the intellectuals, the activist class, etc., they were silent. Now, let me connect this with the academic branch. One way to see this, for me, and this is a personal experience, was I was reading two historians that I do appreciate. I really do appreciate their work as historians, Timothy Garton-Ash and Timothy Snyder. They wrote books, really, really interesting books on the Second World War, Timothy Snyder and the Bloodlands, and et cetera, and Garton-Ash about the end of the collapse of the socialist Europe during the 1980s, et cetera, et cetera. They were quite vocal against Trump, quite vocal against Brexit, quite vocal in defense of the European Union, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I'm not arguing against these positions, but they haven't wrote one line about the October 7th, one line. So this is really interesting to try to grasp how you fail to actually see the thing in front of you when you were paranoid about what is not in front of you. You know, the 1930s are back, the Nazis back, the Nazis are back. This is really nuts. Why do I think it's connected to academia? Back in the 90s, even when that article from 1994 was being written, there was a strong connection between the left, the traditional left, and working class people, trade unionists, and real questions, real matters from work and etc. And now the left is basically an academic branch and nothing more. So when you see this stuff happening, I wonder, how is it possible to send a message in which people can realize what are the effects of a lunatic and completely bogus sort of academic way of life? Now, you're doing this in a way with Spiked, with your column on Spectator and The Sun and your show, etc. But how do you address the failure of this particular institution, the academic world, when you consider the effects and these kinds of effects that we're dealing with?
It's such a good question, and you will all have better insights into the academy than I do. I'm very much an outsider, just throwing stones at the academy. That's basically what I've been doing for the past 20 or 30 years or whatever. I'm a critic rather than a professor. But firstly, the first point in relation to what you said about the 1930s and the discussion about the 1930s, it's so interesting to me because you're absolutely right that we're surrounded by academics and commentators more broadly who, for the past 10 years, have been saying that everything is like the 1930s. Trump, Brexit, populism in Europe. We've seen column after column and university paper after university paper saying that this feels like the 1930s, this feels like the early days of fascism. After 7th of October, they were silent, as you say, but there was something even worse. They started to say, don't compare this to the 1930s. The exact same people who'd been comparing everything to the 1930s said, don't compare this. The Guardian. The Guardian has, for the past 10 years, compared everything to fascism. It published a piece saying, no, don't compare this to fascism. That's dangerous. That's reckless. That's ideologically reckless. I almost couldn't believe my eyes. I couldn't believe my eyes. And that's why one of the chapters in my book deals with this question. It's a chapter about Holocaust envy, which was a difficult chapter to write, but I just thought it was so important to ask, who owns the Holocaust? Who has the right to use the Holocaust as a reference point? Because what's happened over the past year is that Jews have been told constantly that they're not allowed to do that anymore. They're not allowed to compare Hamas to fascists. They're not allowed to say this is reminiscent of what our grandfathers and great-grandparents went through in the 1930s. They're not allowed. They're not allowed to say the word pogrom. Anyone who used the word pogrom after Amsterdam, or indeed after 7th of October, got told off. The only people who are now allowed to use those words are the critics of Israel, who accuse Israel of carrying out a Holocaust, who accuse Israel of carrying out a genocide, who accuse Israeli settlers of carrying out pogroms. So the language of the Jews' own persecution has been stolen from them and weaponized against them. It is such a moral inversion, and it's what it represents, I think, at some really deep level, is Europe in particular, because Europe is where these crimes of humanity took place. It is Europe absolving itself of guilt for the past and projecting that guilt onto the Jews. So the Jews become the monsters that used to persecute them. They are the Nazis. So it's no longer Europe that needs to feel guilty about genocide and Holocaust. It's the Jews. We've now projected it onto them. It's such a sinister intellectual development. It is profoundly sinister. And it does come in large part from the academy. The academy informs this kind of thinking, and the moral relativism that we've seen in some universities over the past few decades has informed this kind of political thinking as well. I get asked by young people all the time, should I go to university? And I used to say, yes, of course you should, because I'm sure most students at university have fun, they learn something, they get a degree, they meet friends, they have sexual relations. I'm sure there's still all those good things at university. But increasingly, I found myself saying, I'm not sure you should go, actually. And if there is something else you could do, there's a job you could get, or an apprenticeship you could do, or travel, maybe you should do that instead. Because in the Anglo-American world in particular, so I don't want to speak to the Brazilian experience or the African experience or the Asian experience, but I know particularly about the Anglo-American campus. I've spoken at many universities in America, many universities in Britain and in Germany and Italy. In those universities, what has happened is that the academy has become a system for reproducing ideology, a system for creating the next political class. And it has become a very formulaic way of reproducing and recreating the rulers of society. It's no longer the open-ended citadel of knowledge and experimental thinking that it might have been in the past. It is now increasingly devoted to educating the young, especially the upper middle class young who go to the best universities, educating them to become the next rulers of society. So they have to have all the right ways of thinking. They have to accept the idea of gender fluidity, for example. They have to accept the idea of white guilt. They have to accept the idea that societies like America and Britain were born in the sins of slavery and empire, and we need to wash away those sins for the rest of time. They need to accept all these fashionable ideas in order to be granted access to the new ruling class. So universities are increasingly devoted to that way of thinking, and it goes across lectures, seminars, public gatherings. And I know from personal experience that if you go to one of these universities to make a speech and your speech runs counter to this ideology, you run a great risk of being banned or being chased off campus or being called a bigot or being protested against. All of those things have happened to me. One of the reasons I stopped speaking at universities in Britain is because every time I did it, there was a protest. At Oxford, at Cambridge, at Durham, there would be people protesting and calling me a bigot, and it just seemed like a waste of my time to do this. I had better things to do than to be told by some posh 18-year-old kid that I'm a bigot. I've got better things to do with my life. But I think that kind of response, even to outside speakers, is indicative of how closed the university has become and how it has become this self-sustaining system of ideological reproduction, and very, very distant from what universities were founded to be, what Oxford was founded to be 1,000 years ago. It was founded to be a place of religious discussion, and then eventually a place of experimental political discussion and enlightened discussion. It was always devoted to asking questions. And now it's devoted to the opposite. Now you're not allowed to ask questions. You're only allowed to give the right answers. And if you don't give the right answers, you could be expelled or blacklisted or whatever. So that's what's happened to the Anglo-American university. It has become part and parcel of the system of elite reproduction. And its old goal of opening minds has been replaced by a new goal of closing them down in order that they will be obedient rulers of society.
I would die to have 5 colleagues with your clarity about university working with me. Two. I would be happy with 2. I couldn't agree more. But let me ask you about a different institution and the role it's playing in all this we are discussing right now, which is the media and journalism, right? Not only because I don't want to stress more than it is necessary the role played by the academics and etc., but especially because I was quite astonished by what was the reaction to the October 7 episode. When we were reading the New York Times, the Associated Press, BBC, etc., right? So let me ask you this. Is it possible to reform this kind of institution? Should we consider that once you have the editor of international affairs in the BBC saying, okay, I got it wrong, I was wrong, there was not an intentional bombing of a hospital by the IDF, but still, I do not regret saying this online. When you reach this point, when you have photojournalists working as terrorists with Hamas, working for the New York Times and the Associated Press, and they say, no, it's okay, and we want to give them an award. When we reach this point, and this is what happened, when we reach this point, is it possible to reform? Is it plausible to continue to read the New York Times or watching the BBC or whatever?
I despair of the Western media. I really do despair of it. It's gone insane. It's really difficult to understand what's happening there. And there are some honorable exceptions, but there are many problems. The BBC is a very good example. I think the BBC's coverage of the Israel-Hamas war has been disgraceful. It's been incredibly biased. It's been prejudiced. It's been flat out wrong sometimes. And as you say, they don't even regret being wrong because it doesn't matter to them. And, it's like, one of the reasons I think so many people were shocked by the result in America last week, by Trump's victory, is because so much of what we see in the world is now filtered through a media elite, a media ecosystem that has its own ideological view of everything. So we don't actually see the truth of what's happening. And so we didn't know. Well, most of us didn't know. I'm sure some people did. And I got a sense of it from speaking to friends of mine in America. But many of us just didn't know that in America, millions upon millions of working class people were openly organizing and talking to each other and saying, let's take a punt on Trump. We just didn't know that. We didn't know how severe the crisis of the Democrats was. We didn't know that Kamala Harris was not landing with any working class voters and was seen as a stooge of the neoliberal elites, which is fundamentally what she is. It was just, we didn't know it because everything gets filtered through a media class that has a particular view on things and which doesn't venture out into parts of the country that it doesn't want to go to. So it doesn't talk to ordinary people. Sometimes it might study them in a way that a Victorian anthropologist might have studied a tribe in Africa. So, for example, just shortly before the election, New Yorker magazine, and I must say I like the New Yorker. It's a bit haughty, it's a bit coastal elite, but it's interesting. They sent one of their reporters to, I'm not making this up. The headline was amongst the low information voters. That's what the headline was. And it had this kind of dark image. And you got the impression that this was like, Joseph Conrad, the Heart of Darkness, venturing into Africa and seeing, oh my God, who are these crazy people? That's what it was like. It had those kind of neo-colonial overtones as this, no doubt very well-educated writer for the New Yorker went amongst the low information voters, the voters who don't know anything, the voters who are stupid. So sometimes they go and study them in that way, but they don't learn anything because they're not engaging with them, they're studying them. They're not talking to them as citizens, they're studying them as almost like animals or certainly strange creatures, a strange tribe. So much of what we see and know about the world comes to us through these filters. And I mean, there's two responses to that. Either one can become very, very cynical, and lots of people are becoming very cynical. And we now have this new movement of people who are just skeptical about everything. They don't believe anything. And you can fall down the trap of conspiratorial thinking sometimes when that happens to you. And I see it all the time, people online saying, I don't believe this, I don't believe that. And, Candace Owens is a good example, the kind of right-wing speaker in America. She started off being quite interesting, talking about the mainstream media and the problem of the Black Lives Matter movement. And then bit by bit, she just became increasingly Israelophobic and in some instances quite anti-Semitic. And she now questions whether certain things happened in the Holocaust. And recently she said, I'm not sure if the earth really is round. Maybe the earth's flat. So you can trace the journey that people go on where they become so cynical and skeptical that they tumble down a rabbit hole of stupidity and wrong think, literal wrong think. That's one option. But the other option, of course, is just to be healthily skeptical and to look for other media representations of the world. And there are one good thing is there are so many outlets now that for that kind of thing. Spiked is one of them, but there are many others around the world that just give a different take or approach things in a fresh way. And for me, one of the most fascinating things about Trump's victory is that he circumvented the mainstream media. He went around the mainstream media and he went directly to podcasts, Joe Rogan, other podcasts, even ones I have not heard of. He talked directly to his own audience, and he particularly talked directly to young men who are not part of this new media ecosystem. Young men who listen to Rogan, young men who listen to these podcasts, who feel really oppressed by modern society, who feel genuinely devalued, who are constantly told they suffer from toxic masculinity, who are constantly told they must atone for the crimes of history that they had nothing to do with, who are constantly told, don't expect to have a job for life and be a breadwinner. That's an old-fashioned sexist idea. They're constantly told all these things. So they move away from the mainstream towards these kind of bubbles in the internet. And Trump spoke directly to them, which I actually think was a very positive thing to do, because it's preferable than someone like Andrew Tate talking to them or some conspiracy theorist. It's preferable if the president of the United States is doing it. So I think the election in America and also the fallout from 7th of October in Europe, both of those events in different ways have exposed the crisis of the mainstream media, the dishonesty of the mainstream media, and the necessity of a new media. And I think that's starting to bubble up.
Wonderful. I have one question from the audience here. I would invite people to ask their questions, both voice here in English or writing for me. But let me just ask this final personal
Can I
question from you.
say, Edu?
Só uma
Vai
última.
lá, vai lá.
I really need to hear from you about this. In your view, what is the connection between the Ukraine struggle against Russia and the Israeli struggle against Hamas? And I'm asking you this because there are some people on the left who can feel some sympathy, or even more than sympathy, towards Ukraine. Progressives, even, I would say, probably moderate, centrist, and progressives in Europe, not the traditional old-fashioned authoritarian left in the Latin American experience, for instance, but at least in Europe and parts of the US. But this is not convertible with what they feel about Israel. And on the right, at least in some circles of the right, they can feel all the empathy necessary to understand what's going on in Israel, or at least they show this, but they don't care about Ukraine. They don't care about Putin dominating territories and all that. How do you see the connection between these two fights?
That's an excellent question. And I have to say, I'm increasingly worried about Ukraine's cynicism on the right. That does worry me a lot. And it's not something I share at all. I support the struggle of Ukrainian liberation against Russia. I think it's important. I think it's in a stalemate at the moment, which is really horrible. And it's difficult to see who will push hardest in order to move it in a different direction. But I think the people of Ukraine have every right to take up arms against the invaders. So I don't share that right-wing hostility to Zelensky and that right-wing hostility to Ukraine itself. I think that's wrong. I think what's so interesting is that you're absolutely right to say that, the left sympathizes with Ukrainians, but not with Israel. And then on the right, it's the other way around. And I do think we need moral consistency on these questions. I really do. And one thing that really gets on my nerves is that sometimes left-wingers in Europe and the liberal establishment as well, they will say, well, Russia is banned from the Olympics and Russians are being subjected to economic sanctions. Why don't we do the same to Israel? Look what Israel's doing. And I just want to shake them and say, I'm sorry, you've got it wrong. In the Middle East scenario, Israel is Ukraine. Israel is not Russia. Israel was invaded on the 7th of October by an army of anti-Semites who killed 1,200 people. Now, just think about the numerical equivalent in Brazil. I don't know what it would be because I can't do maths and I'm not very good at numbers, but it would be hundreds of thousands of people being killed. And it would be a large number in the UK as well. This was an incredibly significant event. This was the worst attack on Israel in its 76 years of existence in one single day. So it was Israel that was invaded by a foreign army. And it was Israel's people who were subjected to the most unspeakable horrors. So Israel is Ukraine. Its territory and its people were violated by a hateful foreign army. So the left completely misunderstands that. They have no capacity whatsoever to see Israelis as victims because they think Israel is a white country. It's not a white country, as most people know. A small majority of the Jews in Israel are actually non-white, and they come from Arab lands from which they were expelled over the past 70 years. But it sees Israel as white and therefore privileged and supremacist, and it can never be the victim. So they have no comprehension that Israel was the victim of 7th of October and has the right to fight back against Hamas in the same way that Ukraine has the right to fight back against Russia. So what I say to people on the right and the left is that, we need moral consistency. We need to, I don't like war, but at the same time, I'm not a pacifist. And I do recognize that sometimes when someone starts a war against you, you do have to fight back. And I think that goes for Israel and Ukraine. And we should support both of those countries equally as they try to deal with the invading forces or the terrorist forces that subjected them to such brutality over the past couple of years. So I think we're seeing Israelophobia poisoning the minds of the left to such an extent that they have almost airbrushed 7th of October from history, and they see Israel as the invading force. And we're seeing something like Ukrainophobia poisoning the minds of the right, who've come to see that Ukraine is the problem, and Russia was only responding to NATO provocations, etc., etc. They're always making excuses for Russia in the same way that the left makes excuses for Hamas. And I would call for a moral consistency that supports both people's right to fight back against their oppressors.
Thank you so much for this. I know you have another appointment here, but can Andrea ask you a question?
Yeah.
May her.
Of course. I was going to ask you and make a joke about what about Islamophobia? Yeah, but I'm not going to do
that. Would be my joke also.
No, my joke. What we say here in Brazil, Brendan, is that every time we are going to talk about anti-Semitism, every time we talk about Judaism, every time the question is not what about Islamophobia? We have, but in Israel, but Netanyahu, this is the question that is addressed to us. So it's the same idea. That's our joke. So sorry. But I'm going to, it's not just a question, but it's, I think I have to say that to you that I'm not only the coordinator of the lab or a professor or I hold a PhD in religious studies, but I'm also the president of your fan club here in Brazil. I don't know if you're aware of that, but you have a fan club here in Brazil, and we would like to know, yes, everybody should read your book. And one of my favorite chapters is The Cult of the Kafir.
Mm.
And I think everybody should read that. And I've mentioned this, I collected thousands and hundreds and dozens of your phrases, and then I posted online and I sent to many people. And then when you talk about cultural appropriation, that it's brilliant here, explained, and then you say, and I would like to read it to everybody because everybody has to be aware of that. That is the 1960s students who protested against the Vietnam War did not wear bamboo conical hats in mimicry of the Vietnamese peasants, who so often felt the heat of the America's bombs and napalm. Western supporters of the Quit India movement were not known for wearing those white robes in the style of Mahatma Gandhi. So solidarity was expressed with words and actions, not imitation of style. And this is all around the world. We go to the campus and we see those people, 18, 19, wearing those kefirs and posting them online. Like you said, the circle of virtues. And do you see them well, in a couple of months, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to use something a little bit stronger to show my solidarity or to show my media performance. How do you see that?
Yeah, that could well happen. They might up the ante and take on some other different garment, maybe something more explicitly modeled on Hamas. Mm-hmm. And we've already seen that. In fact, We've already seen people wearing Hamas headbands, and in London, some people wore a paraglider image to celebrate the Hamas people who paraglided into Israel on 7th of October. So we've already seen that, and we might see more of it. But, with the kafir, a lot of people have said that's their favorite chapter. So I'm happy to hear that. And it's the one chapter that I think is quite funny, because the rest of the book is kind of a bit depressing or very serious anyway. I've now got to the stage where when I see someone with a kafir, I I loudly tut. I just can't help myself. I just think it's such a ridiculous. In the book, I talk about how it's like a sartorial signifier of virtue. It's the
Exactly.
thing you put on to demonstrate that you're a good person. It's all about raising awareness of yourself rather than raising awareness of anything to do with the Palestinian people. But I think one important thing to realize, and this really came home with the Columbia University, is that not only are they mimicking Palestinian style, they're also mimicking Palestinian oppression. So at Columbia University, when they had their Gaza encampment, they were all wearing the keffiyeh. You'll remember that the encampment got kind of shut down, and they made a statement. The students made a statement saying, "We need humanitarian aid. We're starving." And then they went to the gates of the university to receive their humanitarian aid, and they're all there with the keffiyehs receiving this food through the gates as if they were Palestinians in Gaza. And of course, the humanitarian aid was, blueberry muffins or Starbucks coffees or whatever.
Coffee, yeah.
And so I think that's important, because what's really happening here is that the keffiyeh has become a garment through which privileged white kids wash away their sense of historical guilt. They pull on this garment to feel temporarily non-white, temporarily exotic, temporarily oppressed. It gives them that feeling of fleeting oppression, fleeting victimhood, because their lives are, as Eduardo was saying earlier, their lives are so comfortable and they have no problems really, and no tensions and no poverty and no conflict, and that makes them feel guilty and it makes them feel bored. So they pull on the keffiyeh and they stomp through the streets and they say, "We love Hamas," to give themselves a sense of meaning. So in the 60s you had radical chic, when posh white kids would support the Black Panthers or whatever, and the Viet Cong. And, we can criticize that, but it's kind of an understandable, youthful movement. This is something worse than radical chic. This is victim chic. This is mimicking who they see as the most victimized people on earth in order to alleviate their own burdensome sense of privilege. So it's a really weird and strange form of a cultural appropriation. And of course, these are campuses on which a few years ago you would be called a cultural appropriator if you were a white person who ate sushi, and you would be called a cultural appropriator if you were a white person who wore a sari or had cornrows in your hair. And now at those same universities, you will see white kids dressed as Arabs everywhere you look. I mean, it's half comical, half ridiculous, and partly sinister. So I had to write that chapter just to draw out some of those ideas.
Great. I would like to thank you so much, and thank Eduardo, because it's been such an honor, Edu and you. And then I'm going to just end this conversation with, I think, a summary of everything, Edu. And I think it is one of my favorite. Well, I have dozens of favorite phrases. So we live in an era when you can be banished from a university for saying women don't have penises, but you'll be fine if you say kill all the Jews. This is the point that we are. Brendan, I would like just one last question. Has anybody bought the copyrights of your book to translate it into Portuguese?
Not yet, no. And my last book, A Heretic's Manifesto, was, yes, there you go.
It is here. It is here. Esse livro é traduzido, gente.
Yeah. So, but this one not yet. So we'll see.
We'll see. We'll see. Edu, please.
Thank you so much, Brendan. It's a great pleasure. And unfortunately, I can't hold you hostage asking you questions and discussing with you, but it was really a pleasure to have this conversation with you. I can't urge you enough, people, to watch the show. I remember seeing very different people from, Yasha Monk and Susan Neiman to Freddie Gray. Everybody in the show is great, and Brendan is always this really objective, excessively humble at times, because really brilliant, and always a really you know, engaged person. He's really interested to discuss with people from different perspective and different backgrounds. And so you really learn with the show. This is the same with the texts. That's why early in the days, I try to publish some of his articles in Portuguese. And so I can't urge you enough to everybody to buy the book and to read the book and to read this Spiked, etc., etc. And Brendan, I hope we can have different discussions in the future and to have you in Brazil live with us for a good show here. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for having me. I have thoroughly enjoyed it, and I love connecting with Brazil. Next time, I want to do it physically in the country.
You are invited, more than invited to come here to São Paulo.
Let's do this.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody. Tchau, gente. Obrigada.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.